Hello and welcome to Naturedays Outdoor Learning Resources, sponsored by the Gower Society. Now this video is made primarily for school teachers to help them create temporary shelters so that they can make outdoor classrooms in any weather in their school grounds. It's using very simple materials, but hopefully it will give you a flavour of the types of designs of shelters you can use, which are appropriate for different locations, for different types of weather, and also for different sizes. Obviously you do need to think about the size of your class and how many you can fit in, and that will determine the size of the shelter that you need and also the size of the material you need to buy or you need to get hold of. If you have any questions about any of these, then if you look on the comments you'll be able to find my contact details. You can contact Naturedays. They can give you advice on specifics if you've got a location that you're struggling with putting up a shelter. For putting up a temporary shelter, you really only need 4 pieces of equipment. Some waterproof material. Now, most people get tarps. These are plastic tarps that you get from B&Q, you can get from camping shops, and they're quite adequate, they're quite waterproof. They're not the strongest, and the weak points are here by the eyelets. So if you want to attach anything, you can use the eyelets, but they do sometimes rip out of the material. And you can see it, the cheaper the tarp, the more likely that is to actually come apart, and then of course your shelter collapses. More expensive, but more robust are camping tarps. So these ones here have got these tapes instead of the eyelets, so it's not making a hole in it, but actually adding some reinforced material, and you put your rope or your attachment through there. So these will last longer, but they are more expensive. You also need something to tie your tarps up to your anchor points. So you can use string. Don't use parcel string, but sisal string can work fine, and it's natural, so if you do leave it in the environment it will biodegrade. It isn't as strong as paracord. This is paracord, and paracord is a lot of little strings all whipped together, and you end up with a very strong string. You could hold somebody's weight on this, even though it doesn't look like rope. It's stronger or as strong as rope. They also come in lovely bright colours like this. If you have bright orange, it's also reflective. These are really good so they don't become a tangle point or somewhere where you can't see as a trip hazard. You will have to tie some of these into guy ropes. You can either just use a paracord, or you can buy guy ropes that come with runners like these. Now this allows you to shorten and tighten your guys without you having to move your pegs. These are also fluorescent. They glow in the dark, but also it makes them not a trip hazard. If you want quick fixings, then these are very good. These are balls and elastic. So if you take those over to your tarp, all you have to do is slip the elastic through there, put this round something like a twig or a small pole, wrap it round, and that will stay in place. And they're also quick release, and just the strength of the bungee is going to keep it in place. Normal bungees like this, however, if you do use these, be aware that they can break. They're not the strongest things, and if they break off, you do have this metal hook flying through the air. Do not use metal bungees for guy lines, because that will not hold into the peg very well, and if it flips off, then you've got that metal flying through the air. So I don't recommend you use bungees apart from maybe in a static location where you know it's not got an awful lot of tension. If you want to clip something in, carabiners are very useful. Again, can be quite expensive, but you can get cheaper ones. So you could make a loop with your rope, hook the loop on to your carabiner like that, and then you can clip that onto another loop, and that means it's quite easy assembly and easy to disassemble. Pegs to hold up anything that you're tying down. So if you've got any guy ropes, then you'll need to peg them down. Try and use bright coloured ones, or ones that you can bury into the ground. So if you know they're going to be exposed and seen, make sure they're nice and bright. These ones here, the wooden ones, these are homemade ones, these are the ones you can buy. These ones are stronger and they will stay in the ground and will not be pulled out. They're much, much stronger than, say, the metal ones and even the plastic ones. Harder to take out though, however, and of course when they're in the ground they're very difficult to see. So you can bury them all the way down to this point here, you still have something sticking out, and they can be a trip hazard. Metal ones, if you've got cheap metal ones, they'll be aluminium and they bend very easily. And that means that if you bash them in with a mallet, then they will break almost straight away, because as soon as they're bent, it's very hard to use them again. Steel ones, the heavy ones, are much better. These are steel here. And if you've got ones that have got something like a hook on the end, then you can put another peg underneath it and pull it out, or even string through there and tie it on. So these are much better than these V-shaped aluminium metal ones. And then the last thing you might need are some poles. Now these poles here are extendable, so these ones you can undo and pull them up and make them longer and adjust them depending on how tall you want it. And obviously they cost quite a bit. If you want to make your own out of wood, then as long as the wood is nice and green and is not too flexible but also not going to snap or rotting at all, you just make sure it's the right size for you, because you can't obviously adjust those. The first shelter that we're going to show you, temporary shelter, is one from a fixed anchor point, such as two trees which are in close proximity to each other. And this is a washing line tarp. It's also called a camping tarp. So the first thing you need to put up is some kind of ridge line. So again, if you use string, it's got to be strong enough to hold the weight of your tarp. And paracord is probably the best one you can use for this. Don't use anything too thick, because the weight of it's going to have to hold on to that as well. So using whatever knots you can, you need to maintain the tightest, straightest line that you can, because of course if it is not tight, as soon as you put the weight of the tarp on it, it's going to start sagging and then you've reduced the height of it. So consider who's going to be using this, how tall they are, and make sure it's above their head height so that you can stand underneath it. This is going to be the highest point in the shelter, and there will be other points in the shelter where it is quite a lot lower than this. This kind of shelter is fantastic if you've got high rainfall, because the water will be sloping off the roof, as opposed to on a flat roofed one where the water can accumulate in puddles. Now this ridge line has been set up so that it doesn't require any tying on. So we've got special hoops on here, which are posset loops, which have got little carabiners on, so that they can just tie onto the tarp. You're probably not going to have these, so you would have to get another piece of string, tie it to your tarp, and then tie it to either to the ridge line or tie it to the trees themselves. And as you see, we've got this tarp underneath the ridge line. You could just throw it over the ridge line and then you don't have to tie it on to the ridge line. You could just put up a line going from your tarp straight to your tree, and then you don't even need the ridge line that way. But either way, make sure that your two trees are further away than the size of your tarp. You don't want your tarp being wasted right next to the tree where you can't actually access it. So there you've got a nice flat ridge there. Again, think about sighting it. You could have done it between two trees like we have over here, but these are on a slope. And then you've got to consider how accessible and how successful you'll be teaching underneath this with a big slope. We've even got a steeper slope there. Maybe those trees wouldn't be the best ones to actually put a tarp on top of, because you've got this slope here. Once you've got your ridge pole in, your ridge line, you need to put out some guy lines onto the corners of your tarps. Now, how many you need really depends on how windy it is, but you will need at least the corner guys. Now you can buy guy lines for these which have got runners so that you can make them longer and shorter. However, if you want to use string, you can do that and just make a little loop at the end of the string and you can peg that down. There are easy ways to attach guy lines to a tarp so that they're easy to undo, and we'll show you those in the knot section of the film. If you haven't got loops on your tarp, which you probably won't if you're just using a tarp with eyelets, then of course you put it through the eyelet. However, be aware that they are not going to be as strong as if you've got loops. So if you pull too much, you could rip the eyelet out. So 4 guy lines, 1 at each corner, is the minimum you need for this. And if you pull out your guy lines, you can approximate how low your shelter is going to be when you've got it upright, and then you can consider whether you need longer guy lines or whether you actually need a higher ridge line. So think about accessibility. Do you want your students and your staff ducking down to a very low level to get inside it, or are they just going to use the two sides? Once you've got your 4 guide lines in, you can then create your guy lines by putting loops on the end, or if you've got runners, running your runners up, and then you need to use pegs to peg it out. This is only going to be possible, of course, if you've got soft ground that you can use to peg out in. And of course, if you have a look now, you have created quite a substantial trip hazard around your space where you want your students to actually come together. So if you see here the colour of our guidelines, very important. We need to have a very contrasting colour to the grass behind it, and also to whatever you're going to be looking at from upright. So you can have bright orange ones like our ridge line there, and that orange is very good. You can see that very easily. So if you do have particularly tall people, or your ridge line is low, they're not going to walk into it because they can see it. But of course, these are a definite trip hazard. So if your shelter is in a location where you have a lot of through-flowing traffic, lots of people walking around it or through it, then these are going to cause a problem. So you need to make sure they're identified, so they're bright, and then also you tell people about them. So once you've got all 4 of your guy ropes up, you can start to see how much space you've got inside. So obviously we've got a pitched roof here, great for the rain. The rain is going to run off here, assuming the rain is coming down from above, so straight down, or coming from this side or the other side of the ridge. However, rain can go in every direction. So if the rain direction is coming in through this way, there will be no protection from the rain by this shelter. So consider the direction of the rain when you are relocating your shelter. So you may have to find a different site on different days when you have different wind and rain direction. So today we haven't got any rain, so it's fine. But if we had the wind coming from this direction here, we could find that this side started to billow in, and that actually reduces the size, the usable size of your shelter. And also got the potential for these pegs to actually be pulled out. And of course, that's a hazard with flying pegs. So the wind really needs to be running through the centre. So think about the wind direction, southwest in this country. Think about where the trees are in a line, not too far apart, but running in a southwesterly, northeasterly direction. However, if the rain is coming from a weird direction like the north, you may have to relocate to 2 trees in a different angle, and therefore you're going to be having shelter from the wind and the rain in that direction. This is a 3 metre by 3 metre tarp, and if you see, because we've got the angle here, we've reduced our actual ground area here to 2 metres by 3 metres. So if you think about your ratios of how much space you need for your class, this is probably too small for even a class of 15 to sit under safely with 2 metre distancing. So you probably want a larger tarp, maybe a 4 by 4. So a 4 metre by 4 metre tarp would give you probably a 3 metre by 4 metre space. So that might be big enough for your 15. And of course, you could attach it with another tarp next to it on another set of trees. However, we could also increase how much shelter you've got here by raising one side of your tarp. So if you can get some poles, now again you can have camping poles, you can whittle some poles, these are just bits, something that is solid enough to hold the weight. And again, if you're using a tarpaulin, you can just slip the end of it, if you've got a pole, into the eyelet. If you've got tapes, then you can put them into tapes, then hold up the front. Then you need an extra guy line, because one guy line is not going to hold up one of our poles. We would need to have an angle of 45 degrees between those 2 guy lines, and then you can have the maximum height of your pole. It's very, very easy though. At this point, you're going to put a lot of pressure onto those guy lines, and just the smallest touch can allow them to ping off, and that means that your shelter will actually half collapse. So this does make it slightly more vulnerable to having people tripping over it. But if we put 2 guy lines onto this side, then that will make it a bit more stable. You're also doubling your trip hazards as well. So if we can raise up one side of our washing line tarp, we can have our one side at normal height level, the same as our ridge, and a lower side on the other side. If you think about where the wind is coming from, you could easily stop the wind a bit, having the other side very low to the ground, so you would reduce how much space you had, but you could bring that even down to the ground and that would stop the wind. You'd have to peg it down very carefully and very hard and very safely. But then you've got, if we go inside, if you look up, you will have a straight side here, so we've got the whole of this side here, all of the 2 meters, and then the 2 meters slope on this side, so you have got a larger area. This is a fantastic way if it is sunny, because you've got a greater amount of shadow being created by your shelter than if you had it with the ridge on its own. If you want to try and remove some of these trip hazards by getting rid of these guy lines, if you have something else you can use instead of a guy line, then that will be really helpful. Obviously, if you're in an area which has got lots of trees like we've got here, then you can extend your guy line, and instead of having the pole, you can just have an extra long guy line. So if you take out a longer line all the way to a static anchor, so like a tree, try and keep it as high as you can. So think about who's going to be walking past this. You're reducing your hazard, so don't make it a worse one by making it at head height, especially for adults obviously, but using that to then tighten up will make sure that you don't have any trip hazards on the ground. Tightening up lines does require some rope work, as you can see. However, if you want to make it simpler, there are some resources you can buy that mean that they can tighten it up without any knots. There are some cords that you use to put canoes on roofs and things like that that you can tie up, and you ratchet them up, and that means that you can get it nice and tight. It doesn't have to have a good knot to tighten it. They can be quite expensive, however. If you do have any guy ropes that you are keeping on your tarp but you're not using them, make sure you tie them up out of the way. This may be a point where you have water dripping off if you've got rain, and sometimes that's actually quite useful. It's a good way of learning about properties of water and how they move, but also you don't want it too low down because it's a distraction and it might become a hazard if it's low enough for somebody to get their head stuck inside it. So 2 lines now, going from the corners of our tarps to our static anchors at above head height, same height maybe, or maybe just below our ridge line. We've now got the same shelter as we had before, but once the guy lines have been removed, the only hazards you have are the 2 guy lines at the back. There we go, and if we remove that, then it's freestanding. We only need 2 guy lines really, you wouldn't have to put in more than that. So it's freestanding now with those 2 poles. And if a student did happen to run into the pole and the pole did fall over, your whole tarp shouldn't collapse because you've still got those 3 anchor points. And if you tie the string actually to the tarp itself and not onto the pole, then it probably would actually stay up as well. So you might find those poles might be surplus to requirements, so you could actually get away with not having the poles at all. So if you happen to have 2 permanent anchor points which are at a perfect angle away from your tarp, then you can remove your poles, because at the moment they're just a hazard, they're not doing anything. And if you're tied onto the 2 corners of your tarp, the 2 poles can come away, and then you see you've got free access now straight in at all angles from this side. You've got no hazard because you should have your lines way above everybody's head. And you could even move those poles then, and you could move them to the back of your tarp. And now we're creating a different shape shelter completely. We've gone from our ridgeline washing line and then our ridgeline washing line with a flat roof to a total flat roof shelter. Now a flat roof shelter will provide you with the largest area you can get from a tarp. So underneath there you will have your 3 by 4 metre square, or 4 by 4 metre square if you've got a 4 by 4 metre square, so you'll get the maximum amount. However, it does have issues. If you can remove the guys to our trees, we take away the issue of the guy lines apart from where you've got your poles. If you're lucky enough to have a structure where you have 4 trees, In the corners, then you could lay out these longer guys up to new trees. There isn't one here unless you make a very long line to that ash tree over there. So you haven't got too many trip hazards, but the problem with this is if the wind comes in, it's going to blow up through the top of the tarp, up through here, billow it out, and this will pull the lines here off the tops of the poles. It will pull out the pegs. And then, of course, it will still be staying upright on one side, but the other side will be flapping down. And, of course, you'll have pegs flying everywhere. Also, if you've got this set up and it rains, the rain is going to settle inside these billowy areas, and you will have to either remove them periodically, otherwise you could have a collapse because of the weight of the water actually on the tarp. So that's your flat roofed with 2 permanent anchors and 2 poles, using our trees here as well for our ridge line. So when you're dismantling your shelter, make sure you try and take the guys off all the time, because then you can use it again from scratch and you can store them separately. The guys will take longer to dry than the tarp will, so they need to be hung up somewhere to dry. One of the biggest considerations when you're either locating your tarp or thinking about the design of your tarp is whether you want it to be temporary or permanent. And when I say permanent, it's going to be, that means permanently up for the day, not for multiple days. So in our shelter, if we consider the location, if it's going to be a place where the students are going to come out and play at break time, then if you do a risk assessment and you realise that having the guy lines there and the children running around in close proximity, it's not going to be safe, you need to be able to take your shelter down and put it up again quite quickly between break time and your next session without a lot of hassle. So you could just, of course, keep the children away from that area, but consider whether you need it to be quick removal or whether you can just leave it up. And it also impacts on things like what type of knots you use, because there's quick release knots or there's quick release ways in which you can tie it up. You can, of course, leave your ridge line up, because if that's above head height, it's not going to be a hazard. And one really quick method you can use to create a shelter is to create a lean-to. So again, using your ridge line, but this time you're going to connect one end of the tarp to the ridge line, not the central part of your tarp. So just tie it up in with the 2 ends onto your ridge line, and then make it nice and tight across the middle. Then you take out the back of your tarp, connect it all the way to the ground, no guy lines, but directly in with your anchor, like your peg, on both corners here. And there we have very quick setup, no knots required. If you've got a permanent ridgeline or you keep the ridgeline up from day to day, that is a very quick shelter. You've got probably about 3 by 2 meters to go underneath. However, of course, you haven't got the headroom, and if you want to sit in it, that's fine. If you sit down the back to stand in it, you can only really stand at it at the very front. This is great if you want to protect from driving rain from this direction coming in here, or if the wind is very strong and is pushing here, you can also protect from the wind. It will protect from the rain. However, if the rain is coming in from this direction here, it's going to go straight into your faces. So again, consider which direction you need to locate it, dependent on the wind direction and whether the rain is going vertically or horizontally or at a great angle. You can get slightly more space for headroom if you have a central anchor point on your tarp. This usually only happens if you have camping tarps, not on bought tarps from B&Q or places like that. You could put a guy line there. If you've got a tree to tie that to, perfect, you can have it nice and high. If not, your guy line will be going down there and cause a bit of a trip hazard, but you will increase the amount of headroom you have. So there, we've got a little bit more room inside now. You can even use a pole to make that guy line higher up, so you don't have the guy line being the centre of the pole, centre of the tarp being pulled at a steeper angle, and therefore this will collapse. This is a large tarp setup, so we have a 6 metre by 4 metre tarp here, and which has also got a ridge line. This time the ridge line is underneath the tarp is put over the ridge line. This is a much easier way to put up a tarp because the ridge can take the weight of the tarp as you are laying it out. And if you look, we've got our guy lines attaching to high up, way higher than head height on all 4 corners. So you do need to have 4 trees which are bigger than your tarp in the 4 corners. So you do need the right setup of trees or anchor points. Obviously these will be too high for you to reach, so you may need to use something like a stick to push this up to a higher level once you've actually tied it lower down. Then you tie off your actual guy line low down, and if you want a quick release you can do that. So that before you can just undo that, pull the string, and it will come off. However, be aware that your children can also pull the string as well. So this is a truck tarp. So this is your classic B&Q tarp, obviously a big one. And if you have a look, we haven't got the tapes like the camping tarp. We've got the eyelets. And these eyelets are not reinforced. So this one here is not reinforced. This means they can easily break off, and 2 have actually come off while we've been rigging the tarp. So make sure when you put most of your pressure and your weight through your tarp, you do it through the reinforced corner ones. So these ones have been reinforced. It's not as good as the taped ones on the camping tarp, but it will provide a bit more safety and it's less likely to come apart. And so put the corners as your main guying points. Don't use these side ones for any amount of tension. You can use them for guy lines just to stop flapping, but try and maintain most of the energy in your tarp through your taped seams in the corners. So this is pretty much a flat tarp. It could be easily adapted into a pitch tarp just by raising the ridge line higher up and also taking the guy lines which are high up on the corners down closer to the ground. So that would be better for rain, but this is the largest area you could possibly cover for some sunshade, and probably a class would fit inside this trucker's tarp. Other permanent static anchor points are other things in your school grounds that you may be able to tie it to. Just make sure that they are anchored properly and that they're going to take the weight, and do not damage any buildings with your setup. Fences can be used to tie guy lines to, so they are slightly taller, and if they're on tarmac, so you can't actually put pegs into the ground, so it's a good anchor point. Posts which are attached to your school, which have got anchors already, are also things that you can use for permanent anchor points to tie up tarps. Again, make sure that you're not putting too much strain on them and you've got something else to attach it to, maybe a tree to take some of the weight off. Do not tie up tarps or anchor points to things like guttering or any wiring cables or anything that you think is likely to break off, to cause a hazard, but also might damage part of the school building. Netball posts can be used as a portable anchor point. However, if you use both of them and you create a ridgeline between the two, if there is too much weight in the middle of the 2 posts, then they may actually fall. So consider weighting down the bottom of your posts, or even putting in some pegs and anchoring down. This of course has to be done on grass. However, if you want to anchor down onto concrete, and this goes for creating guy lines on concrete, you can fill up containers full of water. So if you have water containers, then a kilogram of water is going to hold down, the number of those would hold down the end of this, so it's not actually going to fall off. Or if you've got anything that's heavy and weighted down, maybe some benches, something you're not using, but something that's going to keep that permanently down when you've got a weight on the top of it. Lamp posts or other posts in your school grounds, again, you can use these as anchor points. Goal posts are also a permanent anchor point that you could use to put up a washing line shelter. You're a bit restricted, but if you've got rugby posts, you've got a bit more room. But of course, if you're going to be using them at break time or lunchtime for football, you will have to remove your shelter, so it's got to be a quick one. But a lean-to shelter works very well with football or rugby posts. If you want to put up a gazebo or a shelter and you've only got tarmac, then you can use some of the setups if you've got something you can have as a permanent anchor point, like something that's on the side of trees. You can also attach guy lines to the insides of windows and use that as long as it's safe and not going to damage your building, or if you've got posts coming off your building. You can also use the netball posts, like here as we said, as your anchor points. However, your guy lines, you obviously can't peg them down, but as I said before, you can use water-filled containers, which are very heavy, that will act as anchors, or you can use bags filled with sand and then tied to the end of the guy ropes, and they make a good anchor point on an impermeable surface that you can't use pegs on. Another shelter that a lot of schools have is the gazebo. Again, very useful because you have that tailored roof here, tapered roof, so the water is going to come down. Make sure it's a waterproof one, so it's not going to bowl, it's not going to accumulate in the roof. You can see we've got a large area here as well because you've got the whole square, and you can put up sides to protect if the wind is coming from one direction or the rain is coming from another. However, they can take off. So you do have guy lines, which of course are a trip hazard, but the more guy lines you have, the more anchored it will be. If you can, on some of them, they also have anchor points at the end of the poles. If you can anchor them down with pegs, that also makes it more stable. However, consider how exposed it is. If you were to place a gazebo in the centre of the grass here, with the wind coming from the southwesterly direction here, then it could get up enough speed to actually blow it away. So even though that'll be a great place to have a bit of shelter because there's no shelter anywhere near it, try and keep your gazebos close to the edge line of some trees or some hedges, and then you'll get the wind shadow behind them, so it's not going to blow it away. So the wind is going to be coming up here and it's actually going to hit the trees, and then it's going to come down way beyond. So we're in a nice wind shadow here. Also think about your shadows in terms of where you're going to get your shade. So this shelter here, this is in the afternoon after lunch, and if you think about it, if you're using this as a sun shelter, so inside the shelter you've only got a third of the actual area actually in shade, and then the rest of it is on the outside. So you actually can't get your whole group in one location in the shade because you've actually got this wall in the way. So you may have to remove the wall. So if you've got gazebos that you can remove the walls, that will be very useful. However, if you locate your gazebo or your shelter so that you are going to get the maximum amount of shadow inside your shelter, inside your gazebo at the hottest point of the day, then you'll be maximizing it and you won't have to think about changing your shelter through the day. So on the south side, we'll have our trees providing shelter in the afternoon. However, if we have those on the north side of our school, then the shadow from these trees at the far end in the north side will actually be outside of the boundary with the school. So anything on your south side which is providing shelter and shadow is going to be great for afternoon shade. In the north side, if you need some shelter up there from the sun in the later part of the day after lunch, then that's where you should really put up any gazebos that you need more shelter from. If you want more permanent structure, then a marquee is possible, but expensive. Just consider things like your guy lines again. Again, they're not usually luminous, so add some luminous ones or some ribbons so they can be seen. Obviously you've got sides that are removable and you've got a metal frame here, so it hopefully will be much bigger than any of the tarp structures. When you're locating it, consider windage, but also consider access. If it's wet, it can be useful that it's near a path, and think about where the door is, where you're going to have entrance into your marquee. Also, we always put additional internal guys to reduce the amount of guys outside, but also to make sure it doesn't blow away. But in high winds, they will go. I hope all this information has been useful for you, and now you feel a bit more confident in putting up some temporary shelters. Just remember that if you do put up a shelter, you should make sure that you test it before you go inside it, and there's no trip hazards, so you do a risk assessment of your shelter before it stays in your yard or is used by anybody. If you are keeping your shelter up, you need to make sure that it's not going to accumulate water and then fall down, and also the windage if it's going to be blown away. Most of the ones I've shown you are temporary shelters that would be taken down during the night. You wouldn't leave those up overnight really, because the fact that they might get damaged, they might even get blown down, or the rain might pull them down. If you've got any questions, or if you like the video, please subscribe to the Naturedays YouTube channel and like down in the comments below. And if you want any more information, then contact me at Naturedays and I'd be happy to give you more advice on putting up temporary shelters. Good luck.